Hello, good evening. My name is Maria Kobielska, and I have a great pleasure and honor to chair this today meeting with Professor Sharon Macdonald, who is here with us, or is in Brussels, but still with us. Sharon Macdonald, just to say a few introductory words, is honorary professor at York, but since 2015, she is based in the Institute of European Ethnology at the Humboldt University of Berlin, where she holds an Alexander von Humboldt professorship as professor of social anthropology, and where she also directs CARMA, the Center for Anthropological Research on Museums and Heritage. Sharon Macdonald's research interests include anthropology, museology, cultural heritage and memory studies, and cultural sociology. She is and was ahead of many major research projects, and she authored many books, one of which is the reason for our meeting. And this is about Memorylands, Heritage and Identity in Europe Today, an acclaimed book originally published 8 years ago, which has been recently translated into Polish by Robert Husek, my friend and colleague, and is now being published by the International Cultural Center in Krakow. So generally, it is our aim to introduce the book to the Polish audience, Polish readers. So we would love to engage in the conversation with those who are now watching us on Facebook. So if you'd like to post any questions or comments during our conversation, you can do this in the chat, and we hope we'll be able to answer them or comment on them somehow. I will start with some very general questions about Sharon Macdonald's book and perspective. And I hope we will be able to go into more detail as the conversation continues. So the first thing I would like to ask is very simple, because it is about the title, and it is about Memoryland and Memorylands. Just judging from the sound of the word, we can think about Memoryland as something similar to Disneyland, as something like the amusement park where we play with memories. Or to put it more gently, we can think about Memoryland as a safe space where a community celebrates its heritage. But we learn from your book that it is also the contrary, an environment of conflicts where great personal risks can be taken, an environment that is insecure or precarious maybe. So what makes a Memoryland or Memorylands?
Oh, thank you so much, Maria, for a good and question that takes me back to thinking about exactly why I gave the book that title. In doing so, I suppose I came first of all from the observation, which isn't just my observation, but that many people had made about this growth of signs of the past and of memory in all sorts of forms. And I mean, I was looking at Europe, but it's not to say that Europe is the only place that this happens, but this was the focus I was interested in. But ranging from museums to monuments to plaques on buildings to signs to practices like reenactment and so on. So things that other people have written about, often in terms of memory obsession or mania, archive fever, heritage crazes, and so on. So in using this term Memoryland, it was partly to just flag up that as a particular historical cultural phenomenon, and to think how it interacted, amongst other things, with placemaking, including the making in the imagination and then on the ground of Europe itself. But your point about the, it could sound like Disneyland, the idea that there's also a theme park dimension to that, or that was a connotation of the term, was one that I did actively kind of take on board and discuss. And partly in order to engage with those debates about popularization and about the economics of it as well, the commodification of the past, as that itself has been such a big debate. But the other side, it definitely was not to say this is the only aspects of it. So just as you say, it was also within that to kind of concentrate or look at as well the multiple dimensions, including these whole areas of difficult and contentious pasts and memories.
Thank you so much. The second thing I would like to take from your title and explore to some extent in the context of Memoryland, of course, is Europe. And, you know, as far as I understand, your aim is to somehow diagnose European Memoryland or Memorylands, or this European memory complex, as you said. And while doing so, you analyze the very wide array of different ways of this presencing the past, making the past present. And when reading through your book, we will surely note that there are so many verbs that indicate what we make with the past. So we make history, make tradition, we tell the past, feel the past, materialize, embody and place, sell, musealize, heritagize, commemorate, and so on and so on. Mm-hmm. But the analysis of this variety shows basically these two sides from which we can approach this European memory complex. On the one hand, you identify these patterns of approaching and experiencing the past that are, as you write, widely shared across Europe. So can we say that there is something like typically European way of presencing the past? But on the other hand, you highlight that there is this diversity of variations, these many memory lands. And you want to somehow explore the marginal to reveal these cultural alternatives that may be different from what we encounter in this official, general, or mainstream knowledge about Europe and about memory. So at the end of the day, can we say what is special about this European memory complex, or shall we just explore many variants that it consists of?
Well, you've just put it absolutely fantastically. So, yeah, I mean, the thing that I tried to do exactly, and I was aware it's quite a hard line to kind of develop through the book, but I mean, but it's exactly what you said. So on the one hand, I wanted to look at a set of shared modes of doing memory, as what I talk about in the book as this kind of particular complex of memory, heritage, and identity, and that those are often kind of thought about at one level in terms of having an identity, having a heritage, and so on. And that goes with particular ideas about property, particular ways then in which the relationship between the past and the present, between identities and histories and memories are really conceptualized. Now, I didn't want, in doing so, to say everywhere is doing that within Europe, or that only Europe is doing that. But I did want to point out that that is one common, maybe dominant, I think one could say, mode of doing memory. But, and this is, you said this really, by looking at what's done, looking at practices and so on, and really looking to sort of on the ground level, we can nevertheless see within Europe that there are alternatives to that as well. And a really big kind of point of the book was to try to say that side is often not really noticed in wider memory debates, partly because of a sort of disciplinary thing that that work's often done by ethnographers or people looking at quite specific cases, and that doesn't always become part of the discussions in other disciplines and things. So yeah, it was exactly to say there's this diversity at one level, but there's also this quite widely shared modes. And in some ways, those diverse or alternative modes show up that it's not just the shared, that's not the only thing that ever can be, sort of.
Would you give our audience a kind of an example of this cultural alternative, something we can reveal while anthropologically or ethnographically investigating European Memorylands that can tell us something totally different from what we could expect from this general level, let's say?
I mean, if I just took one example that, of some work I really like, some work by Paola Filippucci, who worked in rural France. She talks about some people who feel like they have no heritage, and they say, we don't even have cheese where we are. We don't even have the fromage, and they feel that if they're looked at through the usual lens, they're somehow deficient and lacking. And she gives one example where they get involved in one of this sort of project to restore an old graveyard. And what people do there is they go and they clean it all up. And the heritage authorities are like, oh no, it needs to look old to look like proper heritage. So then, but what her argument is actually what they're doing through those practices is showing all sorts of care about the past, and that this is a form of, it could be seen as a form of doing heritage, but it's not the same as the sort of official format. So that's looking at those kinds of examples of what I tried to do in the book. So sometimes they look very much like heritage in some ways and those practices, but we see in different cases kind of different ideas maybe about what counts as authentic, or different ideas about the permeability of the identity categories and boundaries, or the lengths of the histories that are involved, or whether they work in a sort of linear way or jump backwards and forwards and so on.
So these are also different ideas of time, different temporalities, as this in this example you mentioned, we could expect that heritage should be old in a very visible way, yes, and but at the same time renewing this material heritage can show this care, as you said, and but maybe from the point of view of a kind of a heritage cliche or memory cliche, we can say that this is just an example of people with no heritage or with no remembrance of the past. That's how it works. So as we just started talking about ethnographies and anthropologies, I would like to ask you some questions about your the way you work, about your method, about how your book is written. And the first thing is that from the reader's point of view, the book is written in such a way that you, let's say, gather results of many research projects, including your own, but not only. But you somehow explore a very wide range of contemporary anthropological writing, academic writing. And as far as I understand, you want to move beyond this, let's say, case studies perspective. You want to somehow meet these different pieces of knowledge and make them challenge each other in order to be able to interpret them on a more general level Is that how it works for you? Do you think that this is a way of doing memory studies or humanities that we sometimes lack in the academia nowadays?
Yeah, well, I mean, I should say that as an anthropologist, I mean, most of the books I've written are not like that. And I do my own kind of like, the way I normally write and work myself would be to kind of go into particular case studies in more depth. But what I felt and why I wrote that book, and I have to say I found it really hard to do, and but I loved reading all this work, but I was really motivated by feeling that there was all this fantastic work that people were doing, and it wasn't quite kind of maybe finding its way into more mainstream memory studies. Now, it's probably really foolish for me to think that I could help it along, but that was sort of what I was thinking there, really. That if, and I suppose I saw as well quite often, what somebody says in this study and somebody says in this, these could be brought together. So that's what I tried to do there. So it was, I guess as an anthropologist and ethnographer, I was wanting to, show that work and so on. Of course, it was also a sort of impossible task at another level, because there's so much great work, and of course, it's limited by what I managed to read. I tried to bring in cases from lots of places, but it was limited by what I could read in, or primarily in English, and then to some extent in French and German. But it is, I mean, luckily a lot of work does get published in English, but a lot, of course, doesn't. And so there is much more work, and I wish other people would go expand upon it.
Sorry. So to some extent, while writing this book, you work a bit like a translator or curator to somehow put the platform for all this research to somehow resonate together with each other.
Curator, I like that. I hadn't thought of it like that. Yeah, sort of, yeah.
Okay, so while talking about all these pieces of research that should be somehow recognized on the level of memory studies, I also wanted to ask about anthropology and anthropological perspective of your book, and what is once again special about it. In the academia today, virtually everyone does memory studies to some extent. Maybe I am exaggerating because I do it myself, but there is something about it. So can this anthropological way of thinking somehow rearrange the field, maybe allowing us to maybe not generalize, but to be able to recognize some things on this more general level, like to have the courage to say something about European memory or European heritage as such, or within these variations?
Yeah. Tell me if I haven't quite grasped your question, but I mean, the reasons why I felt that the anthropological work had something especially to say were, I mean, partly the thing we talked about already of the difference on the ground, but the way that I suppose a lot of ethnographers' work of the hanging around for quite a bit of time and looking at practice, what actually gets done. So not only at the discourse, but then at the interactions between those. And I think that is an area where you end up finding things that you would never expect, and so it brings something else into memory studies. Having said that, I mean, there's so much great work, and I absolutely recognize that in a whole load of disciplines bring really important insights. And one of the things about memory studies that is, I think, great is just how multidisciplinary it actually is. So I wouldn't want, although I'm trying to sort of like fly the flag for anthropology and ethnographic work, I absolutely recognize the importance of other work too. But I suppose anthropologists are probably a bit more likely to do what I call in the book listening to the quiet voices, the things that maybe don't get into the public arena so much, or at the sort of backstory of the more well-known cases.
And this is because of the experience of fieldwork, of listening to people, this kind of research, am I right?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So there are so many things I would like to ask about your work as an anthropologist, but I also wanted to raise one thing that you mentioned while answering these two questions. I am thinking about this knowledge we have in Europe about European memories and heritages, let's say. And you show also in the book that this knowledge is somehow not evenly distributed, that for instance we have profound memory studies memory research in the context of Greek memory culture, as far as I remember from reading your book, but this, for a reason, this is a language and national context in which it works to such great extent. So how would you somehow sum up where in Europe there are some, I don't know, maybe not blank spots, but some arenas or areas where we should definitely know more about remembering and now lack this kind of research?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I mean, the thing about the Greek work was in the sort of early phase of anthropological work that just happened to build up, I think, a big set of debates, partly because of particular anthropologists who did some very significant work. And yeah, then it became a sort of a continuing theme, but in that case also because of that interesting issue of the idea of Greece as the cradle of European civilization and so on, which kind of set off a set of debates. I mean, since then, and the way with this growth of memory studies and things, I think, is there anywhere that's not been touched by this kind of work? I suspect not really. I mean, at the point when I wrote that book, yeah, I mean, the work on post-socialist contexts was really growing, and that is one of the areas I gave attention to. But I did find less work about certain countries, but I'm just kind of going through countries in my mind. But I can think of people who've worked in many of those since. So yeah, I mean, the other thing is the theme. I mean, it's still uneven, and it's uneven for reasons of, languages and who trains where, and so on. So, I mean, in general, there is less in. Well, there's two things. So I'm sorry, I'm being incoherent here. There's also who does the work, I think, is part of that. And yeah, I mean, there's more researchers working often in the West European countries, but they may do the research in other countries too. And of course, there's mobility between scholars and things. It would be very interesting, though, to really map that out. And I'm suddenly aware as I speak that I don't know quite where that would be at by now.
And what you just mentioned, it also touches one topic which is very interesting for me, which is about this, let's say, central and local perspective or tensions in the academia within memory studies, for instance, because we have a wide range of research about, for instance, my country, about Poland, but I would say that many of the great work, much of the great work which is being done about Poland, just explores this, let's say, mainstream or Western perspective, rather than somehow uses these possible cultural alternatives that maybe could somehow rearrange this thinking about memory and heritage. So I think it's also important to, of course, it is possible for a researcher to explore the national context, which is not their own, as many examples show. But at the same time, I think that we sometimes lack this, let's say, insight perspective, which would use also some other national, for instance, or linguistic traditions, academic traditions, than this, let's say, Western academia, we, of course, all try to be a part of somehow, something like that. What would you say about it from the context of your position in Berlin at Humboldt's, from UK and so on?
No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and I really. There's on the one hand, I kind of do support the idea of people going and doing work that's in a context that's unfamiliar, because there's something unsettling about that. But equally, I do think the kind of depth of knowledge about language and culture and so on, I think we need those perspectives. And I think we need more recognition of different traditions and ways of working in the academy. And I mean, one thing that I think is, so I'm involved with the European Association of Social Anthropology, and I think that is I know that lots of colleagues there really want to support that, and we're looking to think about other ways of doing that. So I mean, if you ask, I mean, being in Britain, being a native English speaker, being in Germany gets me further east, it's true. And at the Humboldt University, I'm into the formerly socialist parts of Europe, but yes, it's still very part of the mainstream academy and approaches, undoubtedly, though I would say that there are different traditions in Germany as well. And I am really, really interested myself in those different histories of disciplines and the different emphases and so on. And I do think we need to find ways of recognizing and speaking to different kinds of traditions and getting rid of some of the kind of arrogances that there sometimes are from certain traditions about what only, you have to do this to count as the right kind of work. And so I think that's a very important thing to do. And those exchanges, and I mean, I try to support people who want to kind of, come on exchange visits and so on, wherever I can.
Thank you so much for this. And since we mentioned Poland, I need to ask you a question about, let's say, East Central Europe and Poland, but not only. I think this is more a question about nations and inclusions and exclusions. in your book, you investigate some, let's say, new forms of memory and heritage that might be considered open or hybrid or transnational or transcultural. But at the same time, you show that nation is still something like, correct me if I'm wrong, a basic frame for collective memory, a default maybe. Even when we take into account Europeanness and cosmopolitanism and diversity and migrations and their results and so on. And of course, when we think about Poland as one of the European memory lands, it is often associated, and rightly so, with the rise of the national, the populist, the exclusive rather than inclusive. And I just want to say that, of course, this has the consequences not only in the context of memory discourse, but also in the context of human life, thinking about what is happening right now in the Polish-Belarusian border. But if cosmo-optimism is not a solution, what can we as memory scholars and as concerned citizens, where can we look for one? How would you frame the question the answer to such question in the context, of course, of your research, but maybe also it is something about engagement of a scholar?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm just wondering about this term, nation as a basic frame. I mean, what these studies I looked at there, and there's others that have come out since, and yeah, I mean, Poland is one case of this. Britain is absolutely another in relation to Brexit and so on. What we see is this re-emergence. I mean, nation keeps popping up again. So we have all these debates about the cosmopolitan and things, but yeah, nations, there was a point at which people thought, oh, the nation state as a form is defunct. It's, I've forgotten who's, no, it's not David Harvey, who said it's too small for the big problems of life and too big for the small problems of life. Nations are going to vanish, and that doesn't seem to happen. They cling on and so on. So, but I suppose I don't think that means that the fact that they do get remobilized and so on so much means that we have to give up on challenging them, especially in relation to the very problematic dimensions of nationness and their populism, clearly. So, I mean, I suppose, I don't know if I'd want to cling on to the term cosmo-optimism, and yeah, the term optimism has been rightly criticized, but I think the hope for greater understandings beyond nation, for critique of the problems of nation, especially in its populist forms, that those can and must always continue. But I think maybe I would just add there too, that I think we do need to try to, as scholars, understand also what motivates people turning to particular forms of nationalism and populism, because just sort of saying, dismiss them all, that might not be the most effective approach.
For sure. So it could maybe somehow push us in such a direction that if cosmo-optimism or this giving up with the nation think, or thinking in the categories of nation, it does not work, we can maybe somehow reconfigure thinking in this framework of nation to such extent that it could include these hybrid or transcultural forms of remembering or of making heritage. And could you maybe also give to our audience an example of this kind of, new form of memory that you investigate in your book, or maybe something else that happened since the book was written? I'm thinking about an example of transcultural heritage, for instance, or hybrid heritage in Europe today.
Yeah. Now I have to think of what might be. So, I mean, in the book, I do look at that, especially in relation to diaspora groups and so on. And one of the things that I've been interested in generally, so I'm quite often interested in I'm interested in the work of museums, and we certainly have seen a real growth, and since that book was written, many more examples of interesting work done by museums with either with diaspora groups or increasingly so, particularly in relation to ethnographic museums of the sort that have collections, well, even from outside, beyond Europe, of actually engaging with groups across and between countries. And so really also there a reconfiguration of nation as not excluding diversities and transnational connections, but actually showing that they're part of things, and often absolute crucial sources of dynamism and so on. So I think there are many cases of that.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the context of this, let's say, rise of populism in such countries as Poland and Hungary, for instance, I am thinking about something like that. I don't know if you agree with me, but I have this general impression that once you somehow let this diversity in this, let's say, national memory complex, it's not so easy to erase it somehow. And I'm thinking about very particular concrete examples, for instance, in the context of museum research that you are an expert of. I am thinking about the Museum of the Second World War in Poland, in Gdańsk, which was designed as a very, let's say, multi-directional and transnational narrative about the Second World War. And then a new management, to put the very long story short, of the museum was trying to somehow interfere within the exhibition, but making some kind of changes within this exhibition that already existed. And I had the opportunity to visit these exhibitions after all these changes. And some of these changes are, of course, heartbreaking for me. But on the general level, I have this general impression that the exhibition is still about multi-directionality and transnationalism, that it's not so easy to somehow erase it, just interfering in some points. So maybe this, let's say, hybrid or new forms of memory and heritage are not so precarious. Maybe they are like strong enough to persist. What would you say?
I love that. As I want to hold on to that would be the case. It's absolutely what I hope is the case. And I'm trying to think about examples. I can't think of, because that is quite a singular example of that process going through. If we think about the overall complement that I suppose the museum land, the museumscape, the amount of diversity and of stories that challenge narrow nationalistic ones, the weight of what there is that doesn't just do the narrow nationalistic in many countries, I think the weight is elsewhere. So I think the there is your position. There's definitely hope for it, but I think we should really go and investigate it directly in lots of countries. But in some ways, that's a sort of a sort of test case, isn't it? Because of that particular process, and if that, maybe it's you though who sees that positive message, and those who want to read the other get to read the other.
Of course, this is something that needs to be somehow theorized and analyzed much more profoundly. But I think this is, let's say, an example where we could maybe start thinking about this, let's say, strength of this change or these new forms once they happen, once they occur in our, let's say, memory environment. I'd like to remind all those who listen to us and watch us, hopefully, that if you have any questions or comments, you can post them, and we'll be possibly, hopefully, able to somehow answer them. But of course, I have much more questions, and some of my questions are also about, let's say, these words that are in the title of your book, which is about identity and heritage in Europe today. And since your book was first published 8 years ago, is there, what would you say, what is the most important change, if there is any, in this European memory complex? Would you say that this, let's say, maybe proliferation or pluralism of these hybrid forms is something we should think about? Or, but of course, on the other hand, we have this other processes connected to political pressures like Brexit and the rise of populism and so on. What would you note as this most important change from your point of view?
Yeah, putting the word today is always a risk, I think.
But
how long is today?
But in the last chapter of your book, you write about the future, so it's even more risky than talking about today.
True. Yeah. So I mean, So first, So in that last chapter, I do kind of address these points that have been suggested, that maybe this whole emphasis on memory is going to come to an end because we're going to be too bothered about other kinds of things, and these things just run out of steam. And at that level, and the argument I made there, that I thought that wouldn't happen, that we're going to keep being obsessed by memory in all sorts of ways, I think in that respect I was definitely right. The growth of memory studies and so on, and the way that so many developments and debates do get refracted or talked and thought through in relation to memory, that is definitely happening. Things that I suppose, have changed. I think the growth of populism has been to an extent that, has been surprising. I mean, as somebody from Britain, Brexit, I mean, I did not see that coming. There's a big, long memory and history that leads into that, particular kinds of colonial nostalgia and very problematic ideas and about the past and national glory and things that definitely were there. There's no doubt about that, but that it would go that far was something I didn't anticipate. In 2013, that's not something I had thought about. So and more widely, that populisms have grown to that extent. That is something I didn't expect, and we absolutely see in all of those how particular ideas about memory, particular kinds of nostalgias, really fuel those and are used as part of the support. So that bit, I guess, one would expect, but those. There's a new level of debate and awareness around colonialism.
Mhm.
That's something that I suppose I see especially in Germany, but it's absolutely not only in Germany. So that, yeah, and that's beyond Europe as well, and really thinking about relations between the global north and global south and so on. So that has increased in that time period. That has come onto the agenda at a wider public level in a way that it wasn't 8 years ago. That it wasn't totally absent, but it was not with the same same presence. And we've seen shifts in things like approaches to restitution and so on. On the more positive, well, that recognition is one of the positive, definitely one of the positive signs. And the other thing that I think is really and linked to that, I think there's been some really fantastic work being done by and with museums and researchers in the whole fields of memory, and looking to do participative and collaborative work. And so, I mean, some of the restitution projects and questions around that are part of that. So that maybe that's back to your point before as well, that there are these developments where that are pushing against the populism, the nationalism as well. So it's a very sort of fraught and ambivalent kind of situation, I think. But there's cause for hope as well as sometimes I don't want to say despair, but less positive emotions.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about this, let's say, global crisis in the context of memory studies, do you think that, let's say, thinking about climate catastrophe we are facing now, does it have anything to do with memory cultures? And is there anything to do for memory scholars and, of course, memory practitioners, workers, and so on, with, let's say, historical awareness in the context of climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely. So it could include work on looking at previous disasters and response to that. So I have some PhD students working, or previous PhD students who've worked in that area, and current ones as well. It's actually what I'm doing here in Brussels right now is the House of European History has a prospective exhibition about waste, and it will involve also lots of other museums from different parts of Europe, including from Poland, the National Ethnographic Museum. And so today I heard lots of presentations by museums from around Europe, and I was really heartened and impressed by so much thinking about things like what can we learn from our collections that can maybe make us think differently in relation to sustainability and so on. Also just these memory institutions, that's how we see museums, as sites at which people can come together and really address and think about those questions. So I think that, the questions of climate catastrophe and so on, I mean, they're terrifying and enormous and so on, but they're not separate from issues of memory.
Mm-hmm. And now I thought, I don't know if it makes any sense, but that's something that just came to my mind, that of course sometimes when we think about cultural memory, we think about, let's say, these solemn cliches that that also work in the context of catastrophes and traumas. And of course, it can be something that forms an obstacle for thinking about the futures, and also it can prevent us from like recognizing new dangers. For instance, if we think about any historical trauma in the framework of the Holocaust, it can somehow, instead of sensitizing us towards what's happening, it can do the opposite. But if we think about memories and past in a more profound way, just allowing these quieter voices, as you said, and these quieter contexts to this stage, it can serve us much better in this, let's say, producing this kind of sensitivity that will be somehow helpful in dealing with present and future challenges. Something that came to my mind in the context of, let's say, memory research tasks in the context of the present and the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think this issue of once you have quite cliched positions on certain histories, one of the risks of that is that then people easily get into a sort of comfortable subject position, that they assume usually that they're on a sort of fine moral basis. And you make me think of something that came up that I thought was really interesting in an EU Horizon 2020 project that I was part of, called Traces, and it was that was the short name for something called Transmitting Contentious Cultural Heritage with the Arts. And so it was really the very interesting whole set of collaborative, co-creative examples there. And one of the things that research did, by often listening right into quiet voices and cases that were not your usual, didn't always follow the usual patterns, so that by presenting those, and I think, for example, one in our Romanian Transylvanian case of restoration of a synagogue there, and they actually presented a case where actually who you would usually think of as the good nationality was bad, and vice versa, in order to kind of and that, I mean, it was an actual historical case, they weren't creating it for the purpose, but just to sort of unsettle people out of having an easy route to those things, so that you would have to engage with it at a moral level, a more complex moral level yourself, and not put it in an easy kind of package of, of course, those are good and those are bad. And that I think it is really important to try and unsettle those easy positions. To
move beyond this, let's say, routine position that we are so used to in the context of the past, but also our present identity.
Absolutely.
So the last thing I would like to ask is very much about today. And so, because I guess we are now in such a position that our conversation will have to end in some minutes. So the last thing I want to ask is about this experience of the pandemic. Do you think that it will somehow reconfigure our thinking about European heritage or European identity? Or will it just be absorbed into these, let's say, patterns and cliches we already have?
Ooh, that's very interesting. I mean, one thing I have noticed in some of the just debates and discussions about it is that nation does reemerge in relation to it. And in some ways there one sees very good reasons for nation reemerging, because of uneven distribution of vaccine, for example, and actually what national governments do and the rules that they come up with. And as you travel across borders, how that works. So in some ways it fits, there's that. There's at another level, it is a shared experience across the world. It reactivates certain memories of previous pandemics and things, the Spanish. And that's interesting why we call that particular flu the Spanish flu.
It's just like these COVID variants that were dubbed British variant or
exactly.
South African variant and so on. And it just has nothing to do with their real, let's say, emergence.
Yeah, so that's a really good example, isn't it, with this, that those do get it's like Michael Billig's idea of this banal nationalism, how this nation ideas just slip in through these adjectives and sort of reinforce nations along the way. Will it reconfigure heritage and identity? I mean, one thing I've been very impressed by is how lots of museums and so on have gone and collected the pandemic. There have been quite a lot of examples of that. So to really recognize that this has been an extraordinary shift for people's lives, and the question of how we will look back on it is interesting. And at least I hope that's how it will be, that we'll be looking back on something that's over, but of course maybe it's a recurring issue. Will it change how we do? The other aspect is that so much had to be done online and digitally during the pandemic, including lots of museums and exhibitions going online. And I think, that wasn't entirely new, those digital dimensions, but I think it's strengthened those, but it hasn't, I don't think, meant that people will all start just doing everything online. We're doing something online right now, but I think we're going to all look forward to getting to actual lands and places and so on as well.
And actual conversations and meetings, of course, but I hope that our conversation today was a bit like a real one or an actual one.
I feel it's just you and me here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Professor Sharon Macdonald was our guest, and I will just remember that her book, Memorylands, under the Polish title Krainę, pamięci, is just being published by the International Cultural Center. So you are all very much invited to read through it and expand what was just said during our meeting. Thank you so much, Sharon.
Thank you. And thank you to the International Cultural Center and to Robert Kuzek for all the work for doing that.
Thank you so much.